Hi, this is John. Painting rockets gives people a lot of trouble, so this video is on some basic techniques for painting. You can get quite nice results with patience and preparation. The rocket that we're going to be finishing is an Estes Nike Smoke, which is a pretty basic design, but has enough complexity that it'll let us try out some techniques. Once kit construction is complete, we start thinking about finishing. This kit is made with a cardboard tube and plastic fins, so it's pretty easy. If we had balsa parts, we would need to seal them first. So wipe down plastic parts with alcohol, make sure they're clean. At this stage you see I've sprayed on a thin coat of primer, and thin is key. Each coat that we put on should be relatively thin. You can make multiple coats. You don't need to wait till the previous coat is fully cured if you're using decent paints. And most importantly, if you put on your coat too thick, you'll get drips. Also, if there's any detail in your model, thick paint coats will obscure that detail. So the level of thickness we want for our first coat of primer is a decent coat overall, but not completely opaque. See in this close-up how the primer gives us a consistent surface, but doesn't cover all the detail. So the purpose of this first coat of primer is to give us a surface where we can see any irregularities and fill them. Notice spiral grooves. This Estes tube is pretty clean, so these grooves aren't bad. If you were using a phenolic tube, the grooves would be much more obvious. Even some of the high-power rocketry paper tubes have stronger grooves. So for this model rocket, the filler that I'm using is Hobby Light. It's very light, sands really easily. For a larger rocket, you might be using Bondo or sandable epoxy or whatever. The process here is just to look for irregularities, fill them, and smooth them over. This is exactly the same regardless of the size of the rocket and the filler material. Our goal is just to alternate filling, sanding, and priming until the surface is smooth enough for paint. And once the filler dries, or cures as the case may be, we sand it smooth. For a small rocket like this and relatively delicate surfaces, I'm going to start with 220. Bigger rockets, you might start with a coarser paper if you're using a you can see very light sanding. Just remove the excess filler all the way around. When you're painting, use smooth, light coats. Work back and forth past the end of the rocket so you don't have heavy spots. Notice how there's a slight glisten, but definitely not a wet coat. After our second priming, we can easily see spots that need additional filling, and we just keep repeating that cycle of fill, sand, prime until we're satisfied. And if there's any magic to painting, here it is. The number of times you go through the cycle of prime, fill, and sand determines your final quality. Once it looks perfect in primer, you're ready to move on to paint. You don't want to move on too quickly because any imperfections, even ones that are barely visible in primer, will jump out when you get to paint. If you have any doubt, go ahead and do another iteration of filling, sanding, and priming. Once you have a primer coat that looks perfect, you're ready to begin fine sanding. Fine sand the primer starting with 320 grit and finishing up with 400. You don't at this point want to take the primer off, and you have just primer so you don't have any filler to sand down. All we're trying to do is get a smooth surface so the paint goes on really well. When you're painting, you want to start with the lightest colors first and then move to the darker ones. In this case, the whole body of the rocket is white with just the fins being contrasting colors. So we'll start by painting the body white. Once again, it's important to paint in light, even coats. This is even more important with your paint than with the primer because you really don't want any drips here. Again, we want to get the body with nice even coats, but we don't need to get the fins with paint at this time because we'll do them later with their colors. So we spray 3 coats of paint on the rocket and then we let it fully cure. Finishing the plastic nose cone is pretty much the same deal. The very first thing you want to do though is thoroughly wash any plastic parts with warm water and soap. This will remove any mold release or other agents that are on the part. Then, once it's cleaned and dried, you sand it very lightly. Don't use anything coarser than 320. Filling is done with plastic filler. Do a final sanding, prime, paint. And then you have your nose coat. Now it's time to mask off the fins, which are painted a different color. So once the paint is dried, we'll use low tack tape. This is Tamiya masking tape. It's important to use low tack so that it doesn't pull up the paint. We did a pretty good job of priming and sanding, so the paint should be firm, but there's no reason to push it. I'm going to mask off the body along the base of the fins. Make sure that you burnish down the edges of the tape so that paint can't seep under them. Once we have the fine masking done, now we just need to cover up the rest of the rocket. You can use regular masking tape. To make this low tack, do a little trick of sticking it on your skin. That takes off some of the stickiness. Now back in the paint booth, we're going to seal the edges. In addition to burnishing down the tape, we'll also paint a light layer of the base coat at the edges of the tape. This will ensure that if there's any bleeding under the tape, it's in the base color so it'll match and you won't have that ragged edge. Once the seal coat has reached the handling stage, it's time for the first color. Oh shit! And that was a paint fail. I made the mistake of not testing the spray can before I used it, and this was one with a bad nozzle. See how the paint's all ragged and dripping? That's failure. Oh well, that'll take repairing. In the meantime, we'll go on to the other color, red, for the other 3 fins. Again, light, even coats, and slowly color the fins. And here's the bad spray paint can. Notice how the paint ran and dripped and splattered instead of coming out as a smooth mist? That's a defective nozzle. You should always check that the paint is flowing properly before you aim it at your rocket. Wish I would have done that. However, it's recoverable. Sanded down the paint once it had cured, and here I am applying the 3rd coat of red. And here's the first coat of yellow going on after sanding down the splattered paint. In general, this is why we prefer to do dark colors over light, because you can see it takes more layers of paint to cover a dark color with a light color. And the third coat. Test. Spray light coat. Turn upside down, clean the nozzle. And then once the last paint color is fully dry, we can unwrap it and see what we got. Now let's see how we did on the color masking. There we go, a nearly perfect line. And so it's not impossible to get a nice looking paint job even with plain old spray cans. I hope this will inspire you to take your finishing up a notch.